Well, I appreciate you tuning in to this short devotion today. I've titled it, Is Suffering Part of Following Jesus? The Apostle Peter wrote something very interesting in his first letter, First Peter, and you'll find it in chapter 4, starting in verse 1. He tells those who identify as Christian followers of Christ that since Christ suffered in the flesh as a man, God clothed in human flesh. Arm yourselves, Peter said, with the same understanding. In other words, the same perspective, the same attitude as Christ did as he suffered in the flesh. Now, why should we do that? Well, Peter tells us why, that we need to live with this understanding and attitude of suffering as Jesus did as a man, because the one who suffers in the flesh, Peter said, in other words, as a human, is finished with sin. Interesting. Obviously, he's not talking about perfection because there's many places throughout the Bible that talks about our imperfection, and Jesus did have perfection. But Peter tells us this. He gives us a reason why we need to be seeking in areas of our life to be finished with sin. And it's in order, Peter says, that we could live the remaining time on earth as a human no longer for this desire or this idolatry that's enslaving us, but for the will of God. That's our purpose. That's our goal. That's our pursuit. And it seems that Peter realizes that if a Christian decides that, okay, you know what, I've had enough with this particular sin, this burden, this thing in my life, my human life, it's no longer going to burden me, enslave me. I'm finished with it. I'm not going to live the remaining days of my life as a Christian enslaved to it, but I'm going to start living according to the will of God. Well, then I believe Peter is saying you got to understand there will be an element of suffering involved in that. There's going to be some various levels of pain involved in doing the will of God as a human that's following Christ. And we're going to have to accept the fact that Jesus suffered himself as Emmanuel, God with us, God clothed in human flesh during his short life on earth. Some might say, well, how bad did Jesus suffer? You know, how bad do I have to suffer? Well, all you have to do is turn to Isaiah chapter 52, 53. You'll get a clear picture of the sufferings of Christ. Let me just quickly list a few. Uh, of course, when he went to the cross, a Roman cross, it tells us that the appearance of Jesus was so disfigured that he didn't even look like a man. He was despised. He was rejected by men. He was a man of sorrow and suffering. People turned away from him. He was despised, and no one valued him. He was stricken, struck down, pierced because of our rebellion. He was crushed because of our iniquities. He suffered oppression but didn't complain. He was cut off from the land of the living and assigned a grave with the wicked. All so that he could represent God as the unique Son of God, a Savior for the sinner, and an example to those that follow him. Now, quickly, let's go back to what Peter said. Maybe now it might have a little deeper meaning to us. Peter says, therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same understanding, because the one who suffers in the flesh is finished with that sin, in order to live the remaining days of his life no longer for human desires, but for God's will. In closing, sometimes the Lord does. He gives us a miracle. We come to Him, Lord, remove this heavy burden, remove this habit, this addiction of what we know is really not the will of God. But most of the time, God expects those that say they love Him and they follow Him to follow the example of Christ's suffering that goes along with being finished with whatever it is that has enslaved us. Why? So that we can project to the world around us the example of Christ and His sufferings and do the will of God. Something to think about, dear friends. Until next time, may the Lord bless you.